We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which the production of this film has taken place. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. On behalf of the Armenian Genocide Commemorative Committee, welcome to Australia's National Commemoration of the Armenian Genocide.
Հայոց ցեղասպանության 105-ամյակի ոգեգոճման հանձնախումբին անունով գողջունենք ցեզ եւ գհրավիրենք միասնապար նշելու հայոց ցեղասպանության 105-ամյակը.
We dedicate this broadcast to the memory of the 1.5 million victims of the Armenian Genocide and honour victims of all genocides. As we mark the 105th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, we remember the organised, calculated and malicious attempt of extermination against the Armenian, Assyrian and Greek minorities living in the Ottoman Empire as perpetrated by the Ottoman Turkish authorities.
Այս հաղորդումը գնվիրենք հայոց ցեղասպանության 1.5 միլիոն նահատակներու եւ բոլոր ցեղասպանություններ ու նահատակներուն հարգելի հիշատակին։ Նշելով հայոց ցեղասպանության 105-ամյակը, գհիշենք Օսմանյան գայսրության դարածքին հայ, ասորի եւ հույն փոքրամասնություններու թեմ Օսմանյան գայսրության իշխանություններուն կողմէ գազմագերբված եւ կորզաթրված ոչնչացման չարամիտ փորձերը։
April 24 will forever be a date ingrained in the collective memory of the Armenian people. In the early morning of April 24, 1915, the Ottoman authorities arrested some 250 Armenian intellectuals and community figureheads in Constantinople, marking the first stage of the Ottoman Turks' attempt to exterminate the Armenian population of the Ottoman Empire. What followed were state-sanctioned, indiscriminate acts of violence, which involved a murderous series of deportations, death marches, and large-scale massacres, with the purpose to end the collective existence of the Armenian.
Ապրիլ 24-ը հայերու հավաքական հիշողության մեջ հավերժ շաղախված թվական մնե։ Օսմանյան գայսրության իշխանություններու կողմէ գազմագերբված հայ բնակչությունը ոչնչացնելու ծրագրի առաջին հանգրվանը եղավ 24 ապրիլ 1915-ին Արավոտյան Գոստանտու Բոլսո մեջ ցերպակալել մոտավորապես 250 հայ մտավորականներ։ Ցերպակալումներուն հաջորդեցին բեդության կողմէ հաստատված բռնության խառնակորձողություններ, դեղահանություն, աքսոր եւ մեծագշիր գոդորածներ, նպատակ ունենալով վերջ տալ հայու հավաքական քոյության։ Պատմական հայրենիքի հողը հաստատորեն բռնած հայու արմատները խլելու Օսմանյան գայսրության մտադրությունը անհերքելի էր, որովհետև անոնք փորձեցին ոչնչացնել հայուգերդած եւ բահբանած հազարավոր դարիներու մշակույթը, լեզուն, ոգին եւ ինքնությունը։
There was the undeniable intent to rip the Armenian roots that were so firmly gripped to the great soils of our land, as they attempted to erode the culture, language, spirit and identity that Armenians had cultivated and preserved for thousands of years. It was only in 1944 that a word could be coined which would so accurately frame the events of 1915 for what it was, a genocide. Dr. Raphael Lemkin, a Polish lawyer and survivor of the Holocaust, proposed for a new classification of international war crimes.
Dr. Lemkin, could you give us a little background on how you came to be interested in this genocide?
I became interested in genocide because it happened so many times. It happened to the Armenians, and after the Armenians, Hitler took action.
1915-ի նպատակադրված վայրակություններն ու գոդորածները ներառող եւ բացադրող ամենաջշգրիտ փարը եղավ 1944-ին հրյական ցակում ունեցող լեհ իրավապան եւ հոլոկոստի վերաբրող դոկտոր Ռաֆայել Լեմքինի կողմէ առաջին անգամ լալով կորցածված ցեղասպանություն փարը։
105 years on, the 1.5 million stories of the Armenian genocide continue to be denied as historical reality by the successors of the perpetrator state. Our history, which is continuously debunked, politicized and equivocated, cannot be denied, as by doing so allows for it to repeat itself once again. As a member of the Armenian Youth Federation of Australia and a representative of the Armenian-Australian youth, I believe that it is our duty to those who left us too soon to remember these legacies and narratives that they left behind. We must ensure their march was not in vain by delivering justice. Recognition is a vital first step to that justice, and it will be delivered.
105 տարիներ անցած են եւ հայկական ցեղասպանության 1.5 միլիոն պատմությունները որպես պատմական իրականություններ դակավին կշարունակվին հերքելու ոչրակորձ պետության հաջորդողներուն կողմէ։ Մենք որպես նոր սերունդի երիտասարդություն պետք է քաչ գիտնանք ու համոզվենք, որ մենք զավակներն ենք 1.5 միլիոն նահատակներու, անթիվ ու անհամար հերոսներու, դոկորված ենք անոնց բայկարի ոգվով եւ պատրաստ ենք շարունակելու մեր բայկարը ցեղասպան Թուրքին թեմ։
2019 was a monumental year for the Armenian cause, as we witnessed the United States Congress recognize the Armenian genocide through resolutions in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. 2019 also saw the Parliament of Portugal and the government of Italy pass similar resolutions recognizing the Armenian genocide while condemning Turkey's denialist regime. Now, governments and parliaments of 32 countries, including the US, Germany, France, Italy, Canada, Argentina, Belgium, Greece, Sweden, the Netherlands, Russia, and Brazil formally recognize the Armenian genocide. We look forward to Australia joining as country number 33.
2019 թվականը հատկանշական էր հայ թադի աշխատանքներուն առընչությամբ։ Ամերիկայի Միացյալ Նահանգներու կոնգրեսի ներկայացուցիչներու բալատն ու զերակույտը ընդունեցին հայկական ցեղասպանության փաստերը հաստատող բանաձևը։ Պորտուգալիա խորհրդարանն ու Իտալիո կառավարությունը եւս ընդունեցին նման բանաձևեր եւ դադարեցին Թուրքիո մերժողական վարչագարկը։ Ցարտ 32 երկիրներու կառավարություններ ու խորհրդարաններ ջանցած են հայոց ցեղասպանությունը։ Անհամբեր ենք, որ Ավստրալիան դառնա հայոց ցեղասպանությունը ջանցող 30-րդ երկիրը։
On behalf of all Armenians, we would like to recognize the role of the Australian community in providing a home for the Armenian people to find their identity once again. Australia should be proud of its history with the Armenian people, with our plight being the country's first government-endorsed humanitarian aid experience. For it was the great ANZAC soldiers who provided us asylum in their barracks, wrote about our tribulations in their journals, and alerted those back home of the injustices. Our keynote feature later in this broadcast will promote this forgotten chapter more.
Որպես ավստրալահայ համայնք, անգամ եւս կուքանք մեր երախտագիտությունը հայտնելու Ավստրալիո, New South Wales եւ South Australia նահանգներուն, Ryde եւ Willoughby քաղաքային խորհուրդներուն, ինչպես նաեւ Ավստրալիո մեջ կորձող բազմաթիվ գազագերբություններու եւ քաղաքական կորձիչներու, որոնք ջանցած ու դադարած են հայոց ցեղասպանությունը։ Գծայնակցինք բոլոր անոնց, որոնք Ավստրալիո տաշնակցային կառավարության շարունական գոչեր գուղեն, վերջնականապես ջանչնալու հայոց ցեղասպանությունը եւ միանալու այս համաշխարհային մարդասիրական արշավին, որուն նպատակն է ոչ միայն վերականգնել պատմական արդարությունը, այլև ներգահիս ու ապակային կանխել նման վայրակություններու գրտնությունը։ Մենք ալ մեր գարկին գուխտենք հավատարիմ մնալ մեր նահատակ նախահայրերուն ուղեկիցին, մնալ հայ ու շնչել հայորեն, ապրել համերաշխ եւ միասնական ծառայել մեր հայրենիքին։ Երախտաբարդ հոգադար քաղաքացիները ըլլալ մեր մեծ հայրերուն, ապահով ապաստան դրամատրած այս երկրին ու ժողովրդին։ Եվ առաջին հերթին մնալ արդար ու մարդասեր, ինչ որալ ըլլան խոչընդոտները։
105 years on, we remember and we demand.
105 տարիներ անցած են, գհիշենք ու գբահանչենք։
Today, on April 24, we remember those tragic events that marked the Armenian Genocide of 1915, when 1.5 million Armenians lost their lives at the hands of the Ottoman Empire. We will never forget, because to forget those events, to forget that genocide, allows denialist states to keep doing those horrific acts time and time again. And today, whilst all of us are impacted by the pandemic, sweeping all corners of the globe. In particular, we remember those victims, and in particular, we gain strength that the motivations of those evil, treacherous acts were not able to suppress a peoples whose history survives for millennia, lest we forget.
104 years ago, more than 1.5 million Armenians were either murdered or forced from their home and their homeland for no other reason but for their ethnicity. That, by any definition, was an act of genocide. We are grateful that more and more legislatures around the world are by resolution now recognising it as such. Trent Zimmerman and I and our other parliamentary colleagues will continue to work towards the Australian Parliament doing the same thing, because it's the right thing to do. I know it's a sad day for my Armenian friends and the broader Armenian community. Today we reflect on all those who suffered at the hands of the leaders of the Ottoman Empire and all those who continue to suffer as a consequences of the acts of 1915.
Այս օրերին Ավստրալիայի Հայդատի հանձնախմբի եւ Ավստրալիա-Հայաստան բարեկամական խորհրդարանական խմբի նախաձեռնությամբ Հայաստանում է ավստրալացի խորհրդարանականների եւ տեղի հայերի պատվիրակությունը։ Նրանք եղել են Ծիծեռնակաբերդի հուշահամալիրում ծաղիկներ դրել անմար կրակի մոտ։ Այնուհետև Եղևնի են տնկել հիշողության պուրակում եւ այցելել են Հայոց ցեղասպանության թանգարան ինստիտուտ։ Ավստրալիայի Դաշնային խորհրդարանի ներկայացուցիչների պալատի падգամավոր Թիմ Վիլսոնը։ Նա արմատներով հայ է։ Ադամյան ազգանունը կրող նրա պապն ապրել է Կալկաթայում։ Առաջիկա օրերին պատվիրակության անդամները կայցելեն Հայաստանի տեսարժան վայրեր, հանդիպումներ կունենան քաղաքական գործիչների հետ։ Նախատեսվում է այցելություն Արցախ։
It's incredibly moving to be here Անհավատալի հուզիչ է լինել այստեղ հայոց ցեղասպանության զոհերի հուշը համալիրում։ Հուշակոթողում արտացոլված է հայ ժողովրդի տառապանքը, որը նաև մենք ենք զգում։
This is my first trip to Armenia.
Իմ առաջին այցն է Հայաստան։ Սա շատ գեղեցիկ երկիր է եւ ես երջանիկ եմ այստեղ լինելու համար։ Ես հուզված եմ, սիրտս լալիս է, երբ նայում եմ Ծիծեռնակաբերդի հուշահամալիրին։ Այստեղ ամփոփված է հայ ժողովրդի հիշողությունը, զգացմունքները եւ ուժը։ Կոթողը ցույց է տալիս, որ տեղի է ունեցել ցեղասպանություն, բայց միևնույն ժամանակ կա հայացք դեպի ապագա։
It's with sadness that we can't all be together to commemorate the 105th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide at these times. But it's an opportunity for the Armenian community virtually to come together to commemorate the lives lost of all of those who were the victim of a genocide 105 years ago. As many Australian Armenians can attest through their own lived experience, their families and their backgrounds, the consequences of the Armenian genocide continue to live with us even to today. Of course, ANZACs were witnesses to the Armenian genocide at Gallipoli. And of course, the first major international aid relief effort for Australia was people coming together to support the victims of the Armenian genocide and setting up orphanages for Armenians in different parts of the world. It was heavily recorded at the time in our media and our newspapers, and it continues to be remembered today. Sadly, there still hasn't been a full acknowledgement of the Armenian genocide by the global community. It's an issue that I and colleagues continue to raise in the National Parliament because we understand the importance of acknowledging the history to make sure that as a global community and as Armenian people, we can heal from the past trauma. It's about addressing attention to injustices and making sure that as a global community, we acknowledge the wrongs of the past so that we can move forward and say, with confidence, with clarity, with certainty, and with action, never again.
Hello and warmest greetings to all my friends in the Australian Armenian community. We cannot be together in one place this year to mark the 105th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, but we can join together as one in spirit to remember and honour the victims and survivors. We live in difficult times, and whether we're thinking about the challenges we face today or the events of the past, we must always speak the truth. Acknowledging the truth of history is the first step to righting wrongs and redressing harm and suffering. Increasingly, the nations of the world are recognizing the truth of the Armenian genocide, and I look forward in anticipation to the day that Australia joins that list. I hope that you and your families stay healthy during this COVID-19 crisis and that we are able to come together as a community soon. Stay safe and God bless.
Hello, my name is Adam Bandt. I'm the leader of the Australian Greens. And on behalf of the Australian Greens, I want to extend my support and solidarity to the Australian Armenian community that is today marking the 105th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. The Australian Greens have long held the position that the Australian government must recognise the Armenian Genocide. It is a scandal that Australia joins Turkey and other recalcitrant nations in refusing to accept and acknowledge this basic fact of history. And so to the descendants of the 1.5 million people killed by the Ottoman Empire, as well as the 1 million Greeks and Assyrians, please know that the Australian Greens will continue to be your steadfast allies in Parliament. We will continue to campaign strongly for Australia to recognise the Armenian Genocide.
In 1919, America's ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Henry Morgenthau, recalled what happened to the Armenians in 1915. When the Turkish authorities gave the orders for these deportations, they were merely giving the death warrant to a whole race. They understood this well, and in their conversations with me, they made no particular attempt to conceal the fact. 105 years ago today, the calculated project by the Ottoman Empire to rid the world of the Armenian race began. By the time it was over, the lives of 1.5 million Armenian children, women and men were lost. Another 1 million Assyrian and Greek lives were also taken by the same perpetrator for the same xenophobic reasons. These millions of people had properties that were confiscated, valuables that were stolen, businesses that were occupied, communities that were ruined, churches that were appropriated. This destruction, along with the deaths, are why that word genocide is so important to us as descendants of survivors of 1915. Because genocide is a word that was designed to characterize the crime that was committed against our great-grandparents, grandparents and parents. A crime, like all crimes, which demands justice. And this is why our community focuses a good portion of its advocacy efforts on informing political leaders in Canberra and other capital cities around Australia about the importance of recognising the Armenian genocide. Recognition by Australia and her states is about what we can do in pursuit for justice for the Armenian genocide. As for the status of the Australian government's position on the Armenian genocide, it is kind of a Houdini act that attempts an array of verbal gymnastics and poorly veiled illusion. All these euphemisms, all this effort to not upset a dictatorship posing as a friendly ally.
Dedeleriniz geldiler. Burada olduğumuzu gördüler. Sonra da kimi ayakları üzerinde, kimi tabutla geri döndüler. Şayet aynı niyetle gelecekseniz sizi de bekleriz. Sizleri de dedeleriniz gibi uğurlayacağımızdan hiç şüpheniz olmasın.
President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has legislated an increase to his power since an attempted coup in 2016, effectively rendering him Turkey's dictator and ensuring full control over the country's judiciary. The man Australia looks to appease, with a position of indifference on such a blatant crime against humanity, has used his self-gifted powers over the last 4 years to jail over 150,000 state officials, teachers, bureaucrats and academics, arrest over 96,000 of his own citizens in connection with the coup plot, shut down over 3,000 schools, dormitories and universities, sack over 6,000 academics, fire over 4,000 judges and prosecutors, close down over 180 media outlets and arrest over 300 journalists. On the Armenian genocide, this same autocratic leader applies foreign pressure on Australia by threatening to close Gallipoli every time a legislature moves towards recognition, using the graves of our ANZAC soldiers as bargaining chips to stop Australia from acting responsibly. In 2013, the Turkish consul in Sydney admitted New South Wales politicians who recognised the genocides would not be welcome in Turkey for the ANZAC Day centenary commemorations.
And the Turkish state has hit back with a threat to the one event that has for decades now underpinned our close diplomatic relations. A Foreign Ministry statement says the proponents of this motion will no longer be welcome at the Gallipoli commemorations.
These persons who try to damage the spirit of Keneally Gallipoli will also not have their place in the Keneally ceremonies, where we commemorate our sons lying side by side in our soil.
The local council at Gallipoli has also made it clear that critics will not be welcome at the centenary celebrations in 2015.
We announced to the public that we will not forgive those who are behind these decisions and that we do not want to see them in Keneally anymore.
So the Premier and members of the Parliament will not be welcome at the 2015 celebrations?
Well, I think one should read the press statement of our ministry carefully. So.
Well, the press statement says they won't be welcome, so one would assume that they won't be given the visas to go.
Yes.
And last year, Prime Minister Scott Morrison, who in 2011 called for Australian recognition of the Armenian Genocide, sensationally admitted to bowing down to Turkey's Gallipoli threats when explaining his backflip, saying, "We've been working closely with the Turkish government to ensure that we continue to have a very strong relationship that enables Australians to make that pilgrimage." This position has not been updated for 2020. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, an illusionary alliance with what is an autocratic and disrespectful Turkey is one reason that Australia's position on the Armenian genocide is untenable. Also making Australia's position untenable are the facts that you have already heard tonight. Stephen Colbert puts untenable best when he says, in order to maintain an untenable position, you have to be actively ignorant. Keep your facts, I'm going with the truth. The truth that Australia is going with is that the Armenian experience at the hands of the Ottoman Empire was not genocide. An active ignorance of the overwhelming facts. This is clearly offensive and unacceptable to us as descendants of survivors who proudly call Australia home. We are also proud because furthering the notion that this position is untenable is the country's politics. The number of federal Australian politicians who actively distance themselves from the official position and call on Australia to unequivocally recognise the Armenian, Assyrian and Greek genocides continues to grow. In recent years, there have been over 20 members from the current parliament that have stood in their chambers on over 40 occasions to call on Australia to recognise the Armenian genocide. If you count those no longer in parliament, those numbers significantly increase. In 2019, the first federal-led Australian delegation visited Armenia, paid their respects at the Armenian Genocide Memorial in Yerevan, and planted a tree thanking the Australians who came to the aid of Armenians, Assyrians and Greeks in 1915. In February this year, the advocacy arms of the Armenian-Australian, Assyrian-Australian and Greek-Australian communities launched the Joint Justice Initiative, which affirms the advocacy priority of these three influential communities for this 46th term of Parliament was seeing the Armenian genocide recognised by Australia. The Joint Justice Initiative now has a dozen signed affirmations of support from current federal parliamentarians who are backing the initiative. This list includes a current minister, government and opposition MPs as well as crossbench supporters. The Australian Greens, Centre Alliance and the Katter Australia Party all back the call for Australia to recognise the Armenian genocide. When the elected representatives in a democracy are increasingly declaring a position that differs to that of the government, it is time that the government reviews and changes their position. It is likely that it is outdated. It is probable that it is wrong. It is definitive that it is indefensible and therefore untenable. We are proud to announce that this week, the peak public affairs body of the Jewish Australian community, the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, and the New South Wales Ecumenical Council added their significant voices to calls for Australian recognition of the Armenian genocide. Voices that already include the Australian Christian Lobby and the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies. Prominent voices in the Australian media, including the country's highest rating radio broadcaster Alan Jones, have started calling the government's position on the Armenian genocide what it is: untenable. Adding to this sentiment of untenability, in late 2019, the United States Congress recognized the Armenian genocide through resolutions in both their House of Representatives and Senate. The threats by the Turkish state against Australian recognition are minuscule compared to those Ankara had made against Washington. It didn't stop them from acting for truth and justice, exposing the Turkish bluff of retaliation. It shouldn't stop Australia from doing the same. The grassroots prioritization of this issue by our community and our ability to constantly renew our fight for justice through generations and technology and through programs like the Armenian National Committee of Australia's Youth Advocates means we will see this battle against the untenable through to the day we chaperone Australia to the position of truth and justice on the Armenian genocide. Thank you to the Armenian-Australian community for your continued and steadfast support of advocacy in the name of human rights. We remember, we demand.
Hi, my name is Serj Tankian. As April 24, 2020 approaches this year, the date that is usually used to commemorate the Armenian genocide, this year we are obviously all in lockdown, so we will be doing a virtual commemoration of the tragic loss of our ancestors and the need to learn the lessons of the first genocide of the 20th century. And those lessons are that genocides are still occurring, that we still put profits over people, and that it's time to formally recognize that genocide and make efforts worldwide to stop these type of things from occurring ever again. Thank you.
There has been a wonderful opportunity that I've had, along with some of my federal colleagues, John Alexander and Tim Wilson, and that was to visit Armenia through a program organised by the Armenian National Committee. And I want to mention the incredible work that Haig and his team did to make that trip happen, but also their ongoing work on behalf of Armenians across Australia. During that trip to Armenia, my first, I have to say that the most moving experience that I had was visiting the Armenian Genocide Memorial in Yerevan. I was very proud of the fact that the three of us were only the second group of federal politicians to be able to plant a tree at the Genocide Memorial. But the memorial itself and the opportunity to lay a wreath there was a very poignant reminder of all of the importance of all of the work that I and others have been doing to try and see the Australian Parliament recognise the Armenian genocide as it should. It was an incredible journey to Armenia, to be able to step foot in a land so ancient, so culturally rich, with such incredible history, was a very special one for me. And it certainly increased my resolve to make sure that the genocide is properly recognised. I also want to acknowledge the work of the ANC for the Joint Justice Initiative, which we had the opportunity to help launch in Parliament House in Canberra February this year, while Parliament was still meeting and while the world was still relatively normal. This is an important initiative which is bringing together the Australian Armenian community, the Assyrian community and the Greek community that all experienced such incredible suffering at the hands of the Ottoman Empire. It is initiatives like this that will make the difference. It is initiatives like this that will bring us together for those who are so committed to human rights and the recognition of genocide. And it is initiatives like this that I hope will bear fruit sooner rather than later. So we meet distantly, but we meet in the same spirit for all of you who are watching today. And I just want to conclude by saying that recognising the Armenian genocide is something that I remain as passionate about today as I have been throughout the short time I've been in federal parliament. We will never forget, and nor should we.
I am here as a genuine friend of the Armenian community and as a person committed to commemorating, remembering, and preventing genocide. Oppression and genocide have deep meaning to the Armenian community and to myself personally. I believe that all genocides require constant remembrance, especially since there are no longer survivors of the Armenian genocide in Australia with us today. I also believe that by acknowledging what happened and the fact that it happened, that you can prevent other acts of genocide from happening. We must also challenge and confront those who deny the Armenian genocide. On a personal note, I've visited Armenia twice, Nagorno-Karabakh, Javak, Western Armenia, the ancient ruins of Kars Van Ani, Masius, and Pokermasis. To my deep pleasure, every time I visit a community around the world, I encounter the Armenian community, whether it is in Tbilisi, Yerevan, Singapore, Lisbon, or Buenos Aires. They have made a wonderful contribution to every community that they inhabit. Currently, there are almost 30 nations that recognize the Armenian genocide. Finally, I hope that one day Australia recognizes the Armenian genocide. And in our lifetime, that Turkey recognizes the Armenian genocide.
On the 21st of August 2013, the ABC's 7:30 reports Michael Bressenden shone a light on Australia's Great War history, a forgotten chapter, and one that is so intricately intertwined with the stories of the Armenian Genocide.
Every April, Australians in their thousands make the pilgrimage to Gallipoli to commemorate the national mythology forged on the beaches of ANZAC Cove. What few Australians realise is that the day coincides with another anniversary of an even more tragic episode in history. On the eve of what Australians call ANZAC Day, Armenians around the world hold their own Day of Remembrance to mark the wholesale annihilation of Armenian Christians in the dying days of the Turkish Ottoman Empire.
Australia has a strong historical memory of the Great War, yet rarely reflected upon is the inescapable narrative that recounts Australia's inevitable involvement with the first genocide of the 20th century, which saw the systematic murder of 1.5 million Armenians and over 1 million Greeks and Assyrians. The Australian Institute for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, under the leadership of late prominent genocide scholar Professor Colin Tatz, became dedicated to unveiling this common history in an effort to combat Turkish state denial, which has sought to influence Australian foreign policy on the undeniable reality of the Armenian genocide.
There is categorical evidence from scholarship around the world that what happened between 1915 and 1922 was a genocide of the Armenians, the Pontian Greeks and the Assyrian communities to the extent of roughly 1/2 of their total population. Never in history has a nation state been so dedicated to the eradication of what they call a lie.
While Professor Tatz bid an untimely farewell to the world in 2019, his pioneering efforts in genocide research inspired a generation of Australian scholars who continue to battle against the influences of the well-researched spin doctors of truth, and importantly, to document the intertwining of Australian and Armenian history. ANZAC prisoners of war, some of whom remained behind after the end of the Gallipoli campaign, were eyewitnesses of the atrocities being committed against the Armenian, Assyrian and Greek peoples during the genocide, recording hidden notes on the scraps of paper about the death marches that travelled through the deserts of modern Iraq and Syria. Surviving ANZAC prisoners of war later reported to the Australian Army of the killing fields and the cattle trucks filled with the bodies of Armenian men, women and children.
Living in the churches, the homes, the monasteries, the community places of the deported indigenous peoples of Anatolia, the Armenians, the Greeks and the Assyrians, the ANZAC and their fellow prisoners of war witnessed, heard about what was happening to these people, to these fellow Christians, and a number of them, when they returned, became very important players or very important informants for the humanitarian relief effort that we are to hear about so much later on. The story of Harold Earl Australian by L.H. Luscombe, who was captured in 1915 in the hills above ANZAC Cove on Gallipoli. Towards midday we stopped at the rail junction town of Eshki-Sehir, or Dorileo, where we were provided with our first meal for the day. At this station we witnessed a sad and depressing sight. On the opposite side of the platform, another train was standing. It was composed of a number of empty two-tier steel sheep trucks. On the platform, a considerable number of Armenian women and children were huddled together. As our train pulled into the platform, Turkish soldiers armed with whips were driving the women and children into the sheep trucks. It was evidently intended to transport them to some distant concentration camp. All the Armenian men that could be were rounded up or liquidated. Some escaped to the mountains and lived there as brigands. The women and children were driven into concentration camps. A guy called George Kerr. This is a diary entry from the 21st of January 1916. Underneath us on the floor of the room were huddled in all kinds of rags about 60 miserable creatures who we afterwards discovered were Greeks and Armenians employed on the tunnel. The tunnel we're referring to is the Taurus Mountains Railway. They were crouched about the fires made in old mess dishes, and in that dull light looked the lowest human beings I had ever set eyes upon. Underneath, the poor brutes were gathered around their fires, which gave forth horrible smoke and poisoned the air with their fumes. Some of the Turks on the opposite side objected to this and made one party put out its fire.
It was only a matter of time that the news of these war crimes would reach Australian shores, from the written words of ANZACs and the notepads of war correspondents. As press coverage reached the Australian people, reporting race-based exterminations and persecutions, the pain and suffering of the Armenians and other Christian minorities of the Ottoman Empire caused great dismay throughout the country. One of Australia's most significant war correspondents of the time, Charles Bean, wrote, "Turks, as the world knows, are at the present moment engaged in an endeavour to wipe out the Armenian nation." Bean and his colleagues left an invaluable mark on Australia's historical recollection of World War I, the Gallipoli campaign, and the construction of Australia's post-war identity. Their thorough documentation significantly included the systematic persecution of the Armenians. Together with the ANZAC testimonies, Bean's writings enhanced the stories of Australia's awareness of the indigenous Armenian, Assyrian and Greek struggle and the intersection between these nations. Their words produced acts of generosity from an unfamiliar people and friendships which have transcended time and space. The feeling of great loss and suffering, as told by the press and ANZAC POWs, gave rise to the creation of government-endorsed humanitarian responses to the Armenian Genocide, which first emerged in Victoria in late 1915.
The Armenian Relief Fund was established in Australia in December 1915 with the purpose of providing aid to the survivors of the Armenian Genocide. The first major grassroots drive of the fund was made in March 1917, when the Lord Mayor of Melbourne, together with other prominent Victorians and church leaders, agreed to set apart a Sunday in April for special collections on behalf of the Armenians. The appeal was a great success, and Melbourne newspapers reported that over £2,000 had been collected as a result. The Victorian State War Council recognised the Armenian Relief Fund as a patriotic fund. That is, one considered as having been formed for the purpose of supporting Australia's allies as well as its own soldiers. By 1918, Armenian relief committees were also formed in Sydney and Adelaide.
Viken Babkenyan, together with the former principal historian at the Australian War Memorial, Professor Peter Stanley, wrote Armenia, Australia and the Great War, which contains many examples of the life-saving generosity of Australians in aid of Indigenous Armenian, Assyrian and Greeks.
Australians were at the forefront in providing relief to Armenian genocide survivors. An exemplary Australian humanitarian was Red Cross nurse Isabel Hutton, who had accompanied the ANZAC Light Horsemen in the Middle East during the First World War. She later joined the American Red Cross and helped provide relief to the tens of thousands of destitute Armenian refugees in Aleppo, Syria. The desperate plight of the Armenians intensified the mobilisation of humanitarian activism back home in Australia during the interwar period. In 1920, a movie called The Auction of Souls was shown throughout Australia. Based on the true story of an Armenian girl who had survived the Armenian Genocide, it premiered at the Sydney Town Hall on the 11th of January 1920 to a sellout crowd. The New South Wales Minister of Education, Mr. James, gave an introductory remark about the importance of the movie in providing awareness to Australians of the suffering of the Armenian people and why they should help them. The Auction of Souls is regarded by film historians today as being the first movie ever made explicitly as a work of advocacy for humanitarian relief. By 1922, every Australian state had an Armenian Relief Committee with regional and sub-branches. The relief movement culminated in the establishment of an Australian-run orphanage for some 1,700 Armenian orphans in Beirut, Lebanon. It was directed by ANZAC veteran Captain John Knudsen and his wife Lydia. The Prime Minister of Australia, William Billy Hughes, promised free freight to the orphanage aboard the Commonwealth line of steamers for the goods collected by the Armenian relief committees. Within a short time, over $100,000, about 1.5 million in today's terms, worth of relief supplies was collected and shipped to the Armenian, Greek and Assyrian genocide survivors from Australia. Dr. Alexander Lipa, Professor of Classics at the University of Melbourne and a member of the Armenian Relief Fund, regarded it as a privilege for Australia, the youngest of nations, to have had the opportunity to save and restore members of one of the oldest of nations.
The Armenian relief movement had mobilised a broad spectrum of Australia's religious, civic and political leaders, with many civilians also at the forefront in providing relief to the survivors of the Armenian Genocide, who found refuge in Greece, Syria, Lebanon and Armenia. These relief committees continued their work until the early 1930s, and as a result of their commendable efforts, a significant number of Armenians, Assyrians and Greeks were saved from death and destitution. In Australia, this landmark response was an early manifestation of the humanitarian ethos that formed part of the nation's engagement with international movements in the interwar period. It is also considered to be Australia's first major international humanitarian relief effort. Thanks to the work of Tats, Diamandis, Stanley, Bob Kenyon and their colleagues, and through the relentless efforts of the Armenian National Committee of Australia, dozens of political leaders have now stood in federal parliament to tell the forgotten chapter in Australia's history, slowly freeing the country from the shackles of threats from denialist dictatorships who hope to bury these stories among with the official use of the term genocide by Canberra.
Australia's first major humanitarian effort can be traced back to the 25th of April 1915, when Australian soldiers responded to calls from persecuted survivors of the Armenian Genocide.
Acknowledge our first humanitarian effort as a country.
I'm proud to recall our state's involvement in the relief efforts for the Armenian people.
Obtain recognition and reparation for the plight of the world's Armenian peoples.
Remembering the victims of the Armenian Genocide and those Australians who came to their aid.
The work and efforts of those Australians who responded to the plight of the Armenian people.
The humanitarian effort with the Armenians, though, was Australia's first.
Particularly important to recognise the humanitarian efforts of Australians.
The marching of Armenians to their death started a mobilisation of Australians for their lives.
Our diggers were amongst the first witnesses to describe the Armenian Genocide, which became our nation's first major international humanitarian relief effort.
Memories of Australian soldiers who witnessed terrible atrocities during the First World War.
We have witnessed the atrocity of the Armenian Genocide.
Australian Flying Corps Captain Thomas White, who was captured in central Mesopotamia, wrote in his memoir that Armenians had sold their lives dearly.
This relief fund of Australia provided humanitarian assistance to victims of the Armenian Genocide.
Many Australian soldiers witnessed the tragic events of the Armenian race, suffered at the hands of the Ottomans. So to commemorate and recognise this almost 100 years after the genocide.
Public opinion has also shifted. with a growing sentiment in Australia to lift Turkey's attempts to silence truth from being spoken.
Members of Australia's Armenian community have rallied in Sydney calling for the Australian government to officially recognise the mass killings of Armenians during the First World War as genocide.
Hundreds of protesters have marched through the city calling on the government to recognise the Armenian genocide.
Members of Australia's Armenian community have rallied in Sydney calling for the Australian government to recognise the mass killing of Armenians during World War I as genocide.
Members of the Armenian community have marched in central Sydney renewing calls for the federal government to recognise the killing of more than 1 million Armenians during World War I as genocide.
24th of April is the anniversary of what's known as the Armenian Genocide. 104 years ago, on the eve of World War I, there were 2 million Armenians in the declining Ottoman Empire. By 1922, there were fewer than 400,000. The others, about 1.5 million, were killed in what's historically termed the Armenian Genocide, because on April 24, 1915, the Turkish government arrested and executed several hundred Armenian intellectuals.
As time goes on and epochs change, so does the representation of history. The intertwined narratives of the Australians and Armenians at the Dardanelles and across the Middle East must not be forgotten, nor should its impact in contributing to the survival of the Armenian people be discounted.
Սիրելի ժողովուրդ, բսակաժահրի այս օրերուն, երբ բոլորս մեր դուներու մեջ գամավոր թե անգամ պանդարգված ենք, ինչպես ավակ շաբաթը ձագազաթեր մինչև զադիկ անցուցինք փակ եկեղեցիներու մեջ, թշպախտապար ապրիլի 24-ն ալ, ուրեմն այս ցևով մզոհ պիտի երթա այս բսակաժահրի երևույթին, սակայն մեր երդասարտությունը եւ մեր նպատակները դեղի չենք դարմենք։ Եթե 1915-ին մեր ժողովուրդը թիմացավ ամեն տեսակ դժվարություններու, սուրի, չուրի, նեղության, գրագի, չարչի եւ թիմացավ այդ բոլորին, այսօր մենք այս երկրի մեջ որ ազատ գաբրինք, բնականաբար դժվարություններ ունենանք, բայց պիտի հաջողենք հաղթել, ոտնադագնել այս դժվարությունները հարուցյալ Քրիստոսի հավատքով։ Այնպես որ իմ հորդորս է, որ մենք թիմակրավենք այս դժվարությունը եւ ապրենք քալիքի նպատակով, մանավանդ որպես ժողովուրդ, որպես հետնորդներ 1915 թվականի մեր նախահայրերուն, որպեսզի կարողանանք իրականության վերածել այնինչ որ մենք գործընծուցինք այնադեն արդարության ճանապարհին։ Ձեր բոլորին առողջություն կմաղթեմ եւ Աստված դա որ այս տարի եթե այսպես եղավ քալդարի ավելի ոգեշնչված կերպով կարողանանք դոնախմբել եւ իսկական դոնի վերածել այս մեր իրավունքներու հարցը եւ անիկա արդար Թադաստանով կարողանանք իր նպատակագետին հասնել։
Սիրելի ասկայիներ, ապրիլ 24-ի հայկական ցեղասպանության 105-րդ դարեդարձի արիթով ուխտենք միասնականություն, ուխտենք վճռագամություն շարունակելու հայտադը ոչ թե միջազգային ադյաններուն արչև միայն, այլ նախ եւ առաջ մենք մեր խիղճերուն արչև, մեր հայու խիղճերուն արչև շարունակելու հայտադը մեր հայ առօրյային մեջ, մեր հայ իրականություններուն մեջ։ Մեր նահատակներուն անթո աջունները գբատկամեն միասնականություն, մեր ասկային, մեր եկեղեցական խիղճը գբատկամե միասնականություն։ Ինչ պատասխան պիտի տանք անոնք, ինչ պատասխան պիտի տանք պատմության, ինչ պատասխան պիտի տանք մեր նոր սերունդին, մեր պատասխանը մեկ է։ Մեր պատասխանը դված ենք արդեն 5-րդ տարուն եւ գմնա հարու նման, գմնա անփոփոխ, սակայն այսօր ավելի քան երբեք բահանջ կգա հարության վգաններու, միության եւ միասնականության վգաններու, որոնք գիտեն ապրիլ ու մեռնիլ
հայրենիքի եւ գրոնքի համար։
Սիրելի հայրենագիտներ, դեպի անգամ ցեզի գմիանանք ցեղասպանության հիշատակության արիտով։ Ցեզի գմիանանք մեր աղոթներով, գաղութենք մեր հայրենիքին համար, գաղութենք մեր ասկին համար, գաղութենք, որ մեր դերը մեր ասկին սեր եւ միություն շնորհե ամեն բարականերու մեջ։ Եվ այսօր նաև գաղութենք այն բոլոր անձերուն համար, որոնք ժամանակ եւ իրենց լավագույնը գուտան, որբեսի հայկական հարցը հարաճ մղեն, որբեսի հայկական հարցը միջազգային ճանաչում ունենա։ Հետևաբար այս բոլոր անձերը, որոնք տարբեր երկիրներու մեջ կգործեն, Աստուծո կբերենք եւ կխնդրենք Աստուծո, որ բոլորին ուժ եւ կարողություն շնորհե, որբեսի գարենան մեր արդար թադը հարաճ դանի, թող դերը օրհնե բոլորը։